Yul Brynner crouched in the shadows behind the elaborate period set, his Leica camera hanging silent against his chest like a predator's weapon waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Watching the volcanic tension build between two goddesses who embodied completely opposite approaches to feminine power and artistic excellence. Summer 1962, Stage 12 at MGM Studios, 3:40 in the afternoon when California heat mixed with studio lights to create an atmosphere thick enough to suffocate lesser mortals. And Hollywood's most explosive star was about to demonstrate why some conflicts between legends could only be resolved through violence that left permanent scars on everyone who witnessed it. If you're fascinated by untold stories of Yul Brynner's most shocking behind-the-scenes encounters, subscribe to Yul Brynner Untold Legacy for more hidden moments where his silent presence captured the darkest secrets of Hollywood's golden age. The massive soundstage reeked of hairspray, stage makeup, and the particular tension that accumulated when perfectionist artists worked under pressure that would crush ordinary people into powder. Elaborate Victorian-era sets stretched toward the rafters like a fever dream of 19th-century opulence, complete with hand-carved mahogany furniture imported from English estates, Persian carpets worth more than most people's annual salaries, and crystal chandeliers that cast pools of golden light across carefully orchestrated chaos. The air itself carried weight, thick with expensive tobacco smoke from Cuban cigars, perfumed with French perfumes that cost more per ounce than gold, and heavy with the accumulated dreams and fears of artists pushing themselves beyond human endurance. Elizabeth Taylor stood beside the ornate fireplace mantel like a caged lioness, contemplating escape through destruction, her violet eyes blazing with fury that had been building for hours like pressure in a steam engine approaching catastrophic explosion. At 30, she remained one of the most beautiful women who had ever drawn breath on this planet, but beauty had become both weapon and burden in a career built on emotional intensity that lesser performers could never hope to match or survive. Her emerald silk gown, custom designed by Adrian to complement her legendary eyes, and crafted from fabric that shimmered like captured light, now seemed to vibrate with the pure rage radiating from her compact but powerful frame. The gown itself told the story of Hollywood excess, thousands of hand-sewn beads creating patterns that caught studio lights and threw them back like green fire, a neckline that suggested sophistication while commanding attention, sleeves that moved with her gestures like liquid poetry. But now the beautiful garment seemed almost incandescent with her fury, as if her emotions were literally setting the silk ablaze. The source of her fury stood 20 feet away, appearing as serene as a swan floating on perfectly still water despite the emotional hurricane swirling around her like a gathering storm. Audrey Hepburn, elegant in a way that seemed effortless but actually cost more discipline than most people possessed in their entire bodies, examined her leather-bound script with a kind of focused concentration that made everything she did look like natural grace rather than professional technique developed through years of rigorous training. Her costume was equally exquisite, but completely different in philosophy. A midnight blue velvet dress that whispered sophistication instead of shouting glamour, cut with such precision that it seemed to have been molded directly onto her slender frame by angels who understood the mathematics of perfect proportion. Where Elizabeth commanded attention through overwhelming sensuality, Audrey achieved the same result through understated perfection that made observers lean forward to catch every subtle detail. Director William Wyler paced between them like a man caught between two different kinds of lightning, one that destroyed through raw power, another that killed through surgical precision. His weathered face showed every line earned through decades of managing temperamental stars, but the strain of this particular production was aging him in real time. At 59, he had directed some of Hollywood's greatest films, from Roman Holiday to Ben-Hur, but nothing in his vast experience had prepared him for mediating a conflict where both sides possessed nuclear-level star power and the will to use it without regard for collateral damage. "That was extraordinary, Miss Hepburn," Wyler said carefully, his voice carrying the diplomatic precision of someone navigating a minefield where every syllable could trigger catastrophe. "The way you conveyed Lady Margaret's heartbreak without speaking a single line of dialogue, that's the kind of performance that wins Academy Awards and changes how people understand what acting can accomplish." The praise hit Elizabeth like a series of physical blows, each word confirming her worst fears about being overshadowed by someone whose approach to acting seemed to require no visible effort whatsoever, no evidence of the struggle that Elizabeth considered essential to authentic artistic expression. For 6 grueling hours, she had poured every ounce of her considerable talent into a breakdown scene that demanded the kind of emotional archaeology that left her psychologically drained and physically vulnerable. The scene had required her to excavate grief from places in her soul that she normally kept sealed and protected. Tears that came from genuine sorrow rather than technical manipulation. Screams that emerged from authentic pain rather than calculated effect. Physical collapse that represented real exhaustion rather than choreographed movement. Everything that made Elizabeth Taylor the most compelling dramatic actress of her generation. The most authentic emotional performer in the history of Hollywood. And then Audrey had stepped into the same scene and accomplished more with a single look than Elizabeth had managed. With her entire arsenal of theatrical weapons, her complete emotional vocabulary, her willingness to sacrifice psychological comfort for artistic truth. "Thank you, Mr. Wyler," Audrey replied with characteristic modesty, her accent carrying just enough European sophistication to remind everyone present that she brought cultural depth to American entertainment. "I was simply trying to honor the character's journey through grief without imposing my own interpretations on her experience." The casual grace of the response made Elizabeth's hands clench into fists that her emerald rings transformed into jeweled weapons capable of drawing blood. Everything about Audrey seemed designed to make Elizabeth's passionate approach appear crude and obvious. Technique instead of inspiration, effort instead of natural gift, American excess instead of European refinement. Yul remained completely invisible in the shadows, his dark clothing making him nearly impossible to detect against the backdrop of elaborate set pieces and sophisticated filming equipment. His presence on the production had been authorized but not announced, part of a personal documentary project cataloging the creative process behind major Hollywood productions. But what he was witnessing through his viewfinder went far beyond normal creative tension into psychological territory that revealed the darker truths about how legendary careers were forged, maintained, and sometimes destroyed. His Leica hung ready against his chest, loaded with high-speed Kodak film specially designed to capture clear images in the dim lighting that characterized professional film sets. Every survival instinct developed through years of photographing dangerous political situations and volatile human conflicts told him that something historically unprecedented was about to occur. Something that would define professional relationships and personal reputations for decades to come. The camera itself was a masterpiece of German engineering, a Leica M3 with a 50mm Summicron lens that could capture images with such clarity that they revealed details invisible to the naked eye. The high-speed film would preserve every nuance of expression, every subtle gesture, every authentic emotion that crossed the faces of these legendary performers when they thought no one was documenting their private moments. "Miss Taylor," Wyler continued, apparently oblivious to the emotional volcano building just feet away from his position. "Perhaps we could incorporate some of Miss Hepburn's subtlety into your next take. The scene calls for restrained devastation rather than what?" Elizabeth interrupted, her voice dropping to the whisper that those who knew her intimately recognized as a warning of impending emotional explosion. "Rather than actually feeling something real? Rather than giving audiences what they came to see instead of some bloodless European pantomime that mistakes repression for sophistication." The insult landed like a perfectly aimed slap across Audrey's composed features, but her immediate response was to become even more still, even more controlled, a reaction that infuriated Elizabeth more than any angry counterattack could have managed. The stillness seemed to mock Elizabeth's volatility, suggesting that authentic emotion was somehow primitive compared to aristocratic restraint. "I wasn't aware that authenticity required volume or theatrical demonstration," Audrey said quietly, her words carrying the kind of aristocratic authority that came from centuries of inherited breeding rather than studio publicity departments, and carefully constructed public personas. The set fell silent except for the mechanical hum of lights and the distant sound of other productions bleeding through inadequate soundproofing. Everyone present, cinematographers adjusting their equipment, script supervisors clutching their notebooks, makeup artists frozen with powder brushes in hand, grips standing motionless beside their equipment, understood that they were witnessing something that transcended normal professional disagreement and entered territory where careers could be permanently damaged. Elizabeth moved toward Audrey with the fluid grace of a predator approaching prey, her silk gown whispering against her legs like secrets being shared with shadows. Each step carried the accumulated weight of every slight, every unfavorable comparison, every moment when her volcanic talent had been deemed excessive or inappropriate compared to Audrey's crystalline perfection. Authenticity, Elizabeth repeated, her voice gaining volume and venom with each syllable as she closed the distance between them. You want to talk about authenticity? You, who've never had an unstaged moment in your entire calculated career. You, who treats every emotion like a chess piece to be moved for maximum strategic advantage. Audrey remained motionless, but something fundamental shifted in her dark eyes. Not fear, which would have been normal, but recognition that this confrontation had moved beyond professional rivalry into personal attack that demanded some form of response, some acknowledgement that boundaries were being violated. Some of us don't require public displays of emotional incontinence to convince people we're experiencing genuine feelings, Audrey replied, her composure remaining intact but her words carrying surgical precision designed to cut through Elizabeth's psychological defenses with maximum damage. The response was devastatingly effective because it contained enough truth to hurt while being insulting enough to justify retaliation. Elizabeth understood that she had been dismissed not just as an inferior actress, but as someone whose entire approach to her craft was fundamentally crude and unprofessional. That's when Elizabeth's legendary self-control finally shattered completely and irreversibly. The slap came without warning, without preliminary gesture, without the kind of theatrical buildup that might have allowed intervention or de-escalation from the shocked observers. Elizabeth's hand moved faster than conscious thought, connecting with Audrey's cheek with a sharp crack that echoed through the soundstage like gunfire in a cathedral, a sound so shocking and unexpected that it seemed to physically assault everyone who heard it. The silence that followed was absolute and terrible, a grayish void that seemed to absorb sound, movement, and breath from everyone present. Audrey stood frozen like a statue carved from marble, one hand rising slowly toward her reddening cheek, her eyes wide with shock that had nothing to do with physical pain and everything to do with the complete violation of civilized boundaries that govern professional relationships. Elizabeth remained in striking position, her hand still raised as if preparing to deliver another blow, her violet eyes blazing with satisfaction and immediate regret warring for dominance across her beautiful features. Everyone on set stood motionless, understanding that they had just witnessed something that would be discussed in whispers for decades, something that transcended normal Hollywood drama and entered the realm of genuine historical significance. In that crystalline moment of suspended time, when shock had frozen everyone present into absolute stillness, a single sound cut through the silence like a blade through silk. The distinctive click of a camera shutter capturing an image that would never be forgotten by anyone who lived to see it developed. Every head turned toward the shadows where Yul Brynner stood, with his Leica, the camera already lowering from his eye as he processed the historical significance of what his lens had just documented. His expression remained perfectly neutral, revealing nothing of his thoughts or intentions, but something in his dark eyes suggested that he understood he had just captured one of the most dangerous images in Hollywood history. Elizabeth and Audrey stared at him with identical expressions of horror, their bitter feud temporarily forgotten in the face of a threat that could destroy both their carefully constructed public personas. The photograph's existence changed everything. It was concrete evidence of behavior that could end careers, ruin reputations, and provide ammunition for enemies who would use it without mercy or hesitation. "Give me that camera," Elizabeth demanded, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to having her wishes treated as unquestionable commands by armies of assistants and subordinates. Yul studied her with the calm assessment that had made him legendary for his ability to remain detached from chaos erupting around him. When he spoke, his accented voice carried absolute certainty about his position and intentions. No. The simple refusal hit both women like a physical blow to their understanding of how power operated in Hollywood. They were accustomed to deference, to having their wishes accommodated by armies of assistants and publicists whose careers depended entirely on protecting their public images. Yul's quiet defiance represented something neither had encountered before: power that couldn't be negotiated with, threatened, or purchased through normal channels. Years later, industry insiders would whisper about the photograph that existed somewhere in Yul Brynner's private archives, an image so potentially destructive that its very existence served as a permanent reminder of how quickly public personas could crumble when authentic emotions overwhelmed careful image management. The forbidden slap became Hollywood legend, not because anyone ever saw the evidence, but because those who witnessed it understood that they had seen something that captured the essential tension between different forms of excellence, different approaches to art, and different ways of wielding the dangerous power that comes with legendary beauty and talent.